The CEO who ruled Wall Street was about to discover the most important lesson of her life would come from the man she'd never even noticed, the janitor who cleaned her floors every night. 10 tutors had failed. 10 of the most expensive, highly credentialed educators money could buy, and her son Daniel was still drowning in tears over simple math homework. Victoria Hayes, the woman who could negotiate billion-dollar mergers before breakfast, stood helpless as her 8-year-old boy sobbed at their marble kitchen island. What she didn't know was that salvation had been walking her halls every evening for 2 years, carrying a mop bucket and the kind of wisdom that can't be bought. This is the story of how a mother's desperation, a janitor's heart, and a child's breakthrough would change everything they thought they knew about success. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The Hayes mansion sat like a gleaming fortress on Beacon Hill, its windows blazing against the Boston twilight. Inside, Victoria Hayes paced the length of her home office, her Louboutin heels clicking a frantic rhythm against Italian marble. The woman who commanded boardrooms with the precision of a surgeon now felt utterly powerless, reduced to watching her empire crumble, not in the stock market, but in her own home. Mrs. Hayes. The tentative voice belonged to Margaret Phillips, the 10th tutor in 6 months. The Harvard PhD stood in the doorway, her usually immaculate composure fractured. I'm afraid I won't be able to continue with Daniel." Victoria's jaw tightened. "What do you mean you can't continue? You've been here 3 weeks." "He's a bright child, truly, but—" Margaret shifted uncomfortably, clutching her briefcase like a shield. "He becomes so distressed during our sessions. The tears, the outbursts, I don't think I'm equipped to handle this level of mathematical anxiety." Mathematical anxiety. Victoria wanted to laugh at the clinical term. What Margaret was really saying was that she couldn't handle an 8-year-old boy who dissolved into panic at the sight of fractions. "I can recommend some colleagues who specialize in learning difficulties," Margaret continued, already backing toward the door. "Perhaps Dr. Richardson from MIT or—" "Get out." Victoria's voice was ice. "Just get out." Margaret fled, her footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Victoria sank into her leather chair, feeling the weight of failure crushing her chest. 10 tutors. 10 brilliant minds, each armed with degrees and theories and methodologies, and not one of them could help her son. The sound of muffled sobbing drifted down from upstairs. Daniel, her precious boy, was crying again. The sound cut through her like a blade sharper than any business setback she'd ever endured. Victoria had built an empire from nothing. At 38, she was the youngest female CEO in her company's history, commanding a multinational corporation with revenues in the billions. She could dissect a balance sheet in minutes, predict market trends with uncanny accuracy, and negotiate deals that lesser minds couldn't even comprehend. But she couldn't help her own son with third-grade math. She climbed the sweeping staircase to Daniel's room, each step heavier than the last. Through the crack in his door, she could see him hunched over his desk, his small shoulders shaking. Homework papers were scattered around him like fallen leaves. Multiplication tables, fraction worksheets, all marked with red ink and tear stains. "Danny." She knocked softly. "Can I come in?" "I'm stupid, Mom." His voice was thick with tears. "I'm just stupid." The words hit her like a physical blow. "No, sweetheart. No, you're not." She entered the room and knelt beside his chair. Daniel's face was blotchy and red, his dark hair so much like his father's, sticking up in wild tufts. On his desk lay a worksheet about fractions, the problems swimming in a sea of eraser marks and frustrated scribbles. "Look at this, he said, pointing at a problem with a trembling finger. "What's 3/4 of 12? I don't understand what it means." Mrs. Phillips tried to explain it with pictures and circles and all these words, but it just gets more confusing. Victoria stared at the problem. To her, it was simple 9. But watching her son struggle with it, seeing the genuine anguish in his eyes, she realized that intelligence meant nothing without the ability to communicate it. "Maybe we just need to find the right person to explain it," she said, though the words felt hollow. How many times had she said that? How many different approaches had they tried? "There isn't a right person," Daniel whispered. "I'm just bad at math, like how some people are bad at singing or running. I'm bad at numbers." Victoria felt her heart breaking. This brilliant, curious boy who could name every dinosaur species and recite entire chapters of his favorite books believed he was stupid because of fractions. "That's not true," she said firmly. "You're incredibly smart. Remember when you figured out why the fish in our pond were dying? You noticed the pH strips made the connection to the new fertilizer." "That's different," Daniel interrupted. "That made sense. Numbers don't make sense." Victoria wanted to argue to convince him, but what could she say if young experts had failed to make numbers make sense to him? Maybe he was right. Maybe some people were just born without the mathematical gene. The thought terrified her. Not because she was ambitious for her son, though she was, but because she recognized the look in his eyes. It was defeat, pure and simple. The same look she'd seen in her own eyes years ago when her father told her she'd never amount to anything because she was just a girl. She'd proven him wrong, of course. She'd clawed her way to the top through sheer determination and refusal to accept limitations. But Daniel was only 8. How could she expect him to fight a battle she'd barely won as an adult? "Why don't you take a break?" she suggested. "We'll figure this out." Daniel nodded listlessly and crawled into bed, still fully clothed. Victoria tucked him in, kissing his forehead and breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. As she turned off the lights, she made a silent promise somehow, some way, she would find someone who could reach him. Back in her office, Victoria opened her laptop and began searching. Learning specialists, educational psychologists, math anxiety experts. She compiled a list of possibilities, each more expensive and prestigious than the last. But even as she typed, doubt gnawed at her. If a Harvard PhD couldn't help Daniel, what made her think anyone else could? Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. "Tomorrow's board meeting moved to 8 a.m. Johnson wants to discuss the Singapore acquisition." Victoria stared at the message, feeling the familiar tug of responsibility. The Singapore deal was worth $200 million. It needed her attention, her expertise. But upstairs, her son was falling asleep, believing he was stupid, and she had no idea how to fix it. She closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city spread out below her like a constellation of ambition and achievement. Somewhere out there were teachers who could reach children like Daniel. There had to be. But as the hours ticked by and the house settled into silence around her, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Some key piece of the puzzle that would unlock her son's potential. She just couldn't see what it was. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. In 6 hours, she'd be in a boardroom commanding respect and wielding power. But here, in the quiet of her home, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life, powerless in the face of her child's pain. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her reading chair. Tomorrow, she would make more calls, research more options, throw more money at the problem. Because that's what she did. She solved things with resources and determination. But tonight, for the first time in her career, she wondered if there were some problems that money couldn't solve. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Victoria's mood perfectly. She dressed mechanically, charcoal suit, pearl earrings, the armor of success, while her mind remained focused on Daniel. He'd barely touched his breakfast, picking at his cereal while staring at his backpack like it contained a puma. "Have a good day at school, sweetheart," she said, kissing the top of his head. "We have a math test today," he whispered. Victoria's heart clenched. "Just do your best. That's all anyone can ask." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The world expected more than anyone's best. It expected perfection, results, success measured in numbers and grades and achievements. How could she tell her son that trying was enough when she'd built her entire life on exceeding expectations? The board meeting was a blur of spreadsheets and projections. Victoria led the discussion with her usual precision, but part of her mind remained at home wondering how Daniel's test was going. When Johnson asked about potential risks in the Singapore market, she rattled off the standard concerns: regulatory challenges, currency fluctuation, cultural barriers, but her heart wasn't in it. "Victoria," Johnson's voice cut through her distraction. "You seem elsewhere today." She straightened, forcing herself to focus. "Just considering all angles. I think we should proceed, but with additional due diligence on the local partnerships." The meeting concluded successfully, as her meetings always did. But walking back to her office, Victoria felt hollow. She'd just navigated a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and all she could think about was her 8-year-old son struggling with fractions. Her assistant Patricia followed her in with a stack of messages. "Dr. Richardson from MIT returned your call. He can see Daniel next Thursday. Also, there's a Dr. Chen from Stanford who specializes in mathematical learning disorders. Schedule them both," Victoria said without looking up. "And keep searching. I want every option." "Of course." Also, the cleaning crew left a note about replacing some supplies. "Nothing urgent." Victoria nodded absently. The cleaning crew came every evening after she and Daniel went to bed, invisible workers who maintained the perfection of her home. She barely thought about them, these people who moved through her space like ghosts, keeping her world spotless and ordered. The afternoon dragged on. Conference calls, contract reviews, strategic planning sessions, the usual symphony of corporate life. But every time her phone was silent for more than a few minutes, Victoria found herself checking the clock, counting down until Daniel would be home. At 3:30, Patricia knocked. "Daniel's school called. He's in the nurse's office, nothing serious, but he got upset during math class and asked to call home." Victoria was already reaching for her keys. "Cancel my 4 o'clock. But the Peterson account, cancel it." The drive to Daniel's school felt endless. Victoria's mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Had he had a panic attack, been sick from stress? She'd read about children whose anxiety manifested physically, whose fear of failure literally made them ill. She found Daniel in the nurse's office, sitting on a small cot with his knees drawn up to his chest. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Hey, baby," Victoria said softly, sitting beside him. "What happened?" "The test," he whispered. "I couldn't remember anything. My brain just stopped working. And then everyone was finishing and turning in their papers, and I was still on the first problem." The nurse, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, approached with gentle concern. "He became quite distressed, started hyperventilating a bit. I had him do some breathing exercises, and he's feeling better now." Victoria wrapped her arms around Daniel, feeling his small body trembling against hers. "It's okay. Tests don't define you." But even as she said it, she knew how empty the words sounded. In their world, tests did define you. Grades opened doors, scores determined futures. How could she tell him otherwise when her entire life proved the opposite? They drove home in silence, Daniel staring out the window at the passing neighborhoods. Victoria wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but every phrase that came to mind felt inadequate. "Mom." Daniel's voice was small. "Why can't I be smart like you?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "You are smart, Danny. You're incredibly smart." "No, I'm not. Smart people don't cry during math tests. Smart people don't need 10 different teachers. Smart people don't make their moms worry all the time." Victoria pulled into their driveway and turned to face her son. His young face was etched with a pain that seemed far too old for his years. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "Intelligence comes in many forms. Just because you struggle with one subject doesn't mean you're not brilliant. Then why does everyone act like math is so important? Why do I have to learn it if I'm smart in other ways?" Victoria opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. How could she explain the arbitrary importance society placed on certain skills? How could she tell him that yes, unfortunately, mathematical competence was often treated as a measure of overall intelligence? "Because," she said finally, "learning to work through difficult things makes us stronger. And I believe I know that we'll find a way to make math make sense to you." Daniel nodded, but she could see he didn't believe her. Why should he? 10 tutors had tried and failed. At what point did persistence become delusion? That evening, Victoria sat in her office going through the motions of work while her mind churned. She'd built her career on solving problems, on finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. But this problem, her son's struggle, seemed to defy every strategy she knew. She was deep in thought when a sound caught her attention. Voices coming from somewhere in the house. But that was impossible. She and Daniel were alone, and he'd been in his room for hours. Victoria stood and followed the sound, her curiosity overriding any concern. The voices seemed to be coming from the kitchen area, soft and patient. As she moved closer, she could make out words, "See if you think about it like pizza slices." Victoria froze. Someone was in her house teaching math. Her first instinct was alarm, but something about the voice, gentle, unhurried kind, made her pause. She crept closer, staying in the shadows of the hallway. The kitchen was dimly lit, but she could see 2 figures at the breakfast bar. One was clearly a child, though not Daniel. This boy looked older, maybe 10 or 11. The other was a man she recognized, but had never really noticed. James Carter, the janitor from the cleaning crew. He was using bottle caps to demonstrate fractions, his voice patient and encouraging as he guided the boy through the concept. "So, if this is our whole pizza and we eat 3 pieces out of 8, what fraction did we eat?" 3/8, the boy said tentatively. "Exactly. And how much is left?" The boy counted the remaining bottle caps. 5/8. "Perfect. You see, fractions aren't scary. They're just a way of talking about parts of things. Like when your mom cuts a sandwich in half, that's fractions too." Victoria watched in amazement as the boy's face lit up with understanding. This was the same child who'd been struggling with tears just minutes before, now grasping concepts that had eluded him for weeks. James noticed her presence and looked up, startled. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize anyone was still awake. Marcus here was having trouble with his homework, and I thought—" "No, it's fine," Victoria said quickly. "I was just— How did you do that?" James looked confused. "Do what?" "Make it make sense to him. I've been watching for 10 minutes, and he understands more now than he has in weeks of tutoring." The boy Marcus beamed with pride. Mr. James explains things really good. He doesn't use big words or complicated stuff. He just shows you with things you already know. Victoria looked at James with new eyes. He was probably in his 40s with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. His clothes were simple but clean, his manner gentle but confident. There was something about him, a patience, a natural understanding that none of her expensive tutors had possessed. "Marcus is my son," James explained quietly. "His mom works late shifts at the hospital, so sometimes he comes with me to work. I try to help him with homework when I can." "And you're good at it," Victoria observed. "Teaching, I mean." James shrugged modestly. "I just remember what it was like to struggle. Sometimes the fancy explanations make things harder, not easier." An idea was forming in Victoria's mind, wild and unprecedented, but impossible to ignore. Would you consider tutoring my son?" James blinked in surprise. "Your son, Daniel. He's 8 and he's been struggling with math. We've tried many approaches." "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified." "You just taught a complicated concept to Marcus in 10 minutes, Victoria interrupted. "What qualifications do you need beyond the ability to connect with a child?" James looked uncertain. "I don't have degrees or certifications. I barely finished high school myself." "But you have something more valuable," Victoria said, thinking of Daniel's tear-stained face. "You have patience and kindness and the ability to make things make sense." Marcus tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, you should do it. You're really good at helping with homework." James looked at his son, then back at Victoria. I'd need to think about it and talk to my wife." "Of course. Take all the time you need." Victoria pulled out her business card and wrote her personal number on the back. "Call me when you've decided." As James gathered up the bottle caps and prepared to leave, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of another expensive tutor or complicated methodology, but something deeper. The hope that came from witnessing genuine understanding bloom in a child's eyes. "Thank you," she said, as James and Marcus headed for the door. "For showing me that learning doesn't have to be painful." James paused. "Mrs. Hayes, your son, he's not broken. Sometimes we just need to find the right way to reach someone. Every child can learn. Sometimes the problem isn't the student, it's how we're teaching." After they left, Victoria stood alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the silence of her perfect home. For the first time in months, that silence didn't feel heavy with failure. It felt pregnant with possibility. She thought about Daniel upstairs, probably lying awake worrying about tomorrow's homework. Soon, very soon, she might have something new to offer him. Not another prestigious tutor with impressive credentials, but something infinitely more valuable. Someone who understood that teaching was about connection, not just instruction. Victoria climbed the stairs to check on Daniel one more time. He was asleep, his math homework still scattered across his desk like evidence of a battle fought and lost. But tomorrow might be different. She kissed his forehead gently and whispered, "Everything's going to be okay, sweetheart. I promise." For the first time in months, she actually believed it. Victoria barely slept that night. She found herself replaying the scene in her kitchen over and over, the gentle way James had explained fractions, the light that had dawned in Marcus's eyes, the simple truth that had eluded 10 expensive tutors. When dawn finally broke through her bedroom windows, she was already dressed and pacing. Daniel emerged from his room looking like he'd slept as poorly as she had. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usual morning energy was nowhere to be found. "Morning, sweetheart," Victoria said, forcing brightness into her voice. Ready for breakfast? I guess. Daniel slumped into his chair at the kitchen island, the same spot where she'd witnessed the miracle of understanding just hours before. Do I have to go to school today? The question pierced her heart. Why wouldn't you want to go? Because everyone's going to get their math tests back, and everyone's going to see that I failed. Again. Victoria set down his cereal bowl and knelt beside his chair. Danny, look at me. Your worth isn't determined by one test score. Easy for you to say, Daniel mumbled. You're smart. You never failed anything. If only he knew. Victoria thought of all the rejections she'd faced, all the times she'd been told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, tough enough. But Daniel was 8 years old, too young for those hard truths about failure and resilience. Actually, she said carefully, I did fail things, lots of things. The difference is that I learned to see failure as information, not a judgment. Daniel looked up at her with skeptical eyes. What do you mean? I mean that when something doesn't work, it tells us we need to try a different way. It doesn't mean we're stupid. It means we haven't found our way yet. But what if there is no way? What if I'm just one of those people who can't do math? Victoria's phone rang before she could answer. She glanced at the caller ID and her heart skipped. It was James Carter. I need to take this, she told Daniel. Finish your breakfast, okay? She stepped into the hallway and answered. Hello? Mrs. Hayes, this is James Carter, from last night. His voice sounded nervous. I talked to my wife about what you asked. Victoria held her breath. And she thinks I'm crazy for even considering it. Says I don't have the education to teach a CEO's son. James paused. But I keep thinking about what you said. About patience and kindness being qualifications, too. They are the most important qualifications, Victoria said firmly. I'd like to try, James said quietly, if you're sure, but I have conditions. Name them. First, we do it at your house after my regular work hours. I can't risk my job with the cleaning company. Second, if it's not working, if Daniel gets more frustrated or upset, we stop immediately. I won't be another person who makes him feel bad about himself. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. Here was a man who barely knew her son, already thinking about Daniel's emotional well-being above his own pride or profit. Third, James continued, I won't take money for this. This isn't about business. It's about helping a kid. James, I couldn't ask you to do that. Your time is valuable. Mrs. Hayes, with respect, everything in your world has a price tag. Sometimes that makes things more complicated, not less. Let me do this because I want to help, not because you're paying me to. Victoria closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the man's integrity. When can you start? Tonight, if that works. I usually finish my route around 7. I could come by around 7:30. Yes, that would be perfect. Victoria paused. James, thank you for giving us a chance. Don't thank me yet. Let's see if I can actually help first. After hanging up, Victoria returned to the kitchen to find Daniel pushing cereal around his bowl without eating. Danny, I have something to tell you, she said, sitting beside him. I found someone new to help you with math. Daniel's face fell. Mom, please. I can't handle another tutor giving up on me. This one is different. They're all different. Until they're not. Daniel's voice was flat, resigned. Who is it this time? Another professor, another doctor? Actually, he's a janitor. Daniel looked up, confused. A janitor? His name is James Carter. Last night I saw him teaching his son fractions using bottle caps. Danny, I watched a child go from confused to understanding in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. But janitors don't teach math, Daniel said slowly. Says who? Some of the best teachers aren't in classrooms. Sometimes they're the people who understand what it's like to struggle, who know how to explain things in ways that make sense to real people. Daniel considered this. What if I'm too stupid, even for him? Victoria took her son's hands in hers. Daniel Edward Hayes, you are not stupid. You are creative and curious and kind. You notice things other people miss. You ask questions that make me think. Just because numbers are hard for you doesn't erase all the ways you're brilliant. Then why does it feel like the only thing that matters? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria realized that despite all her words about different kinds of intelligence, her actions had told a different story. The parade of tutors, the anxiety, the focus on fixing Daniel's mathematical weakness, she'd inadvertently sent the message that this one subject defined his worth. You're right, she said quietly. I've been acting like math is the most important thing in the world. It's not. You are. Your happiness, your confidence, your joy in learning, those are what matter. But I still have to learn it right. Yes, but we're going to find a way that doesn't make you feel broken. James, Mr. Carter, he might be that way. Daniel nodded slowly. When is he coming? Tonight, after dinner. Victoria squeezed his hands. Danny, I want you to promise me something. If it's not working, if you feel frustrated or upset, you tell me immediately. We stop. No questions asked. Really? Really? This isn't about forcing you through another method. It's about finding someone who speaks your language. For the first time in weeks, Daniel smiled. Okay, I'll try. The rest of the day dragged endlessly. Victoria found herself unable to concentrate during meetings, her mind constantly returning to the evening ahead. What if she was wrong about James? What if his success with Marcus was a fluke? What if she was setting Daniel up for another disappointment? Patricia knocked on her office door around 4 o'clock. The Johnson report is ready for review, and you have the Morrison call in 20 minutes. Cancel the call, Victoria said, without looking up from her computer. Cancel it. But you've been trying to reach Morrison for 3 weeks. Reschedule it for tomorrow. I need to leave early today. Patricia's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Victoria Hayes never left early. She was usually the last person in the building, working long into the evening with the dedication that had built her empire. Is everything all right? Patricia asked. Everything is hopeful, Victoria said, surprising herself with the word. My son has a new tutor tonight. Oh, another professor, Victoria smiled. No, a teacher. She arrived home to find Daniel in the living room, his homework spread across the coffee table. But instead of the usual tears and frustration, he seemed focused, even calm. How was school today? She asked, settling beside him on the couch. Better. We got our tests back. Daniel held up a paper marked with a large red F and a frowny face sticker. Victoria's heart sank. Oh, sweetheart. But you know what, I looked at it, and I didn't cry. I just thought about what you said, that it's information, not judgment. It tells me I need to learn a different way. Victoria stared at her son in amazement. 8 years old, and he was already developing resilience that some adults never learned. I'm proud of you, she said, meaning it completely. That kind of thinking, that's real intelligence. Will you tell Mr. Carter I failed the test? I want him to know what he's working with. The honesty and self-awareness in Daniel's voice brought tears to Victoria's eyes. If you want me to, yes. At 7:30 exactly, the doorbell rang. Victoria opened it to find James Carter standing on her doorstep, holding a worn leather messenger bag and looking nervous. "Come in," she said warmly. "Daniel's excited to meet you." James stepped into the marble foyer, his eyes taking in the obvious wealth surrounding him. "Ma'am, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Your house is... This is a different world from what I'm used to." "Money doesn't teach children, James. People do." She led him to the living room where Daniel was waiting, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his math homework. The boy looked up as they entered, his expression guarded but curious. "Daniel, this is Mr. Carter," Victoria said. "Mr. Carter, this is my son Daniel." James set down his bag and knelt to Daniel's level. "Hi, Daniel. Your mom tells me you're having some trouble with math." "I'm really bad at it," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "I failed my test today. I wanted you to know that before we start." James nodded seriously. "Thanks for telling me. Can I ask you something? What do you like to do when you're not thinking about math?" Daniel brightened. "I like dinosaurs, and I like building things with Legos, and I like cooking with my mom sometimes. Those are all really cool things. You know what they all have in common? Know what? They all use math, but in ways that don't feel like math." James opened his bag and pulled out an assortment of objects: bottle caps, wooden blocks, coins, even some small toys. Cooking uses fractions when you measure ingredients. Building uses geometry and spatial relationships. Even dinosaurs involve numbers: how big they were, how long ago they lived. Daniel leaned forward, intrigued. "I never thought of that. Most people don't. We act like math is this separate thing you do at school, but really it's everywhere. It's just usually disguised as other stuff." James picked up one of Daniel's math worksheets. "Can I see what you're working on?" Daniel handed over the fraction problems that had defeated 10 other tutors. "These don't make sense to me. Like, what does 3/4 even mean? It's just numbers and lines." James studied the worksheet, then looked at Daniel thoughtfully. "You said you like cooking, right? Have you ever helped make cookies?" "Yeah, all the time." "And when you're making cookies, do you ever eat some of the dough?" Daniel grinned. "My mom says I'm not supposed to, but sometimes." James laughed. "Don't worry, I won't tell. But think about this: if your mom makes cookie dough and splits it into 4 equal parts to bake 4 batches, and you sneak and eat one of those parts, how much of the total dough did you eat?" Daniel thought about it, visualizing the scene. "One of the 4 parts. Exactly, 1/4. And if you ate 3 of those parts, which would be a lot of cookie dough, by the way, you'd have eaten 3/4. Daniel's eyes widened. "So 3/4 means 3 pieces out of 4 total pieces. That's exactly what it means. And when the problem asks what 3/4 of 12 is, it's asking if you have 12 cookies and you eat 3 out of every 4 cookies. How many cookies did you eat?" Victoria watched from the doorway, barely breathing. Daniel was leaning forward, engaged in a way she hadn't seen in months. "So I need to figure out how many groups of 4 are in 12, Daniel said slowly. "Right. How many groups of 4 cookies would you have if you had 12 cookies total?" Daniel used his fingers to count. 4 plus 4 plus 4. 3 groups. Perfect. So if you eat 3 cookies from each group and you have 3 groups, how many cookies did you eat? 3 plus 3 plus 3, 9 cookies. Daniel's face lit up with understanding. So 3/4 of 12 is 9 to. Exactly. You just solved the problem that was frustrating you earlier. Daniel stared at his worksheet in amazement. But it seemed so hard before. It seemed hard because nobody explained it in words that made sense to you. There's nothing wrong with your brain, Daniel. You just needed someone to speak your language. Victoria felt tears rolling down her cheeks. In 15 minutes, James had accomplished what months of expensive tutoring had failed to achieve. But more than that, he'd given Daniel something invaluable, the belief that he could understand. "Can we try another one?" Daniel asked eagerly. "Absolutely. But first let me ask you something. How did that feel? Understanding the problem." Daniel considered the question seriously. "Good. Really good. Like when you finally remember a word that was on the tip of your tongue." That's exactly what learning should feel like. Not scary or frustrating, but like solving a puzzle. James pulled out another worksheet. "Ready for the next one?" They worked together for the next hour, James patiently translating each abstract concept into concrete terms that Daniel could visualize. Fractions became pizza slices and candy bars. Decimals became dollars and cents. Word problems became stories about real situations Daniel could imagine. Victoria found herself learning too, watching James's method. He never made Daniel feel stupid for not understanding immediately. Instead, he celebrated each small breakthrough, each moment of connection. When Daniel got confused, James didn't repeat the same explanation, louder or slower. He found a completely different way to approach the concept. "You know what I noticed about you?" James said, as they finished the last problem. "You're really good at seeing patterns and asking good questions. Those are the most important math skills anyone can have." "Really, really. Some people memorize formulas, but the best mathematicians are the ones who understand what the numbers mean. You're already doing that." Daniel beamed with pride. "Can you come back tomorrow?" James laughed. "If your mom says it's okay, I'd be happy to." Victoria stepped into the room. "It's more than okay. Daniel, why don't you go get ready for bed? You can tell me about what you learned while I walk Mr. Carter out." Daniel gathered his papers, no longer scattered evidence of failure, but organized proof of progress. "Mr. Carter, thank you for making it make sense. Thank you for being willing to try a new way," James replied. After Daniel headed upstairs, Victoria walked James to the door. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "In one session, you've given him more confidence than he's had in months. He's a smart kid. He just needed someone to show him that his way of thinking isn't wrong, it's different." James paused at the door. "Mrs. Hayes, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why is this so important to you? I mean, obviously you want your son to succeed, but there's something else. Something personal." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "When I was Daniel's age, my father told me I'd never amount to anything because I was just a girl. I spent my whole life proving him wrong, achieving more than he ever dreamed possible. But watching Daniel struggle, it brought back that feeling of being told you're not good enough, not smart enough. And you don't want him to carry that burden." "Exactly. I want him to know he's capable of anything, not because he has to prove it to the world, but because it's true." James nodded, understanding. "Intelligence isn't one size fits all, Mrs. Hayes. The world would be a pretty boring place if everyone's mind worked the same way." "I'm beginning to see that." Victoria smiled. "Same time tomorrow. I'll be here. And Mrs. Hayes, don't worry so much. Daniel's going to be fine. More than fine, he's going to be exactly who he's meant to be." As James walked to his car, Victoria stood in her doorway watching him go. This man who cleaned her floors every night had just given her son something she couldn't buy, with all her wealth, the gift of believing in himself. Upstairs, she found Daniel already in his pajamas, sitting on his bed with his math homework. "Mom, look." He showed her the worksheet, now completed with confident answers. "I understand fractions now. They're not scary anymore." Victoria sat beside him, marveling at the transformation. "How do you feel?" Smart, Daniel said simply. For the first time in forever, I feel smart. You've always been smart, sweetheart. Now you know it too. As she tucked him in, Daniel asked, Mom, why didn't any of the other tutors explain it like Mr. Carter did? Victoria considered the question. I think sometimes very educated people forget what it's like to not know something. They assume everyone learns the same way they do. But Mr. Carter remembered what it feels like to struggle, and that made him a better teacher. Daniel yawned, already drowsy. I can't wait for tomorrow's math class. I want to show Mrs. Peterson that I understand fractions now. Victoria's heart swelled with joy and relief. This was what she'd been hoping for, not just understanding, but excitement about learning. James had given Daniel more than mathematical knowledge. He'd restored his love of discovery. Sleep well, mathematician, she whispered, kissing his forehead. Mom, yes. I'm glad the other tutors didn't work out. If they had, we never would have found Mr. Carter. Victoria smiled in the darkness. Sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. As she closed Daniel's door, Victoria felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new battles to fight. But tonight, her son was sleeping soundly, no longer burdened by the weight of believing he was broken. James Carter had done more than teach fractions. He'd reminded them both that every child could learn, every mind had value, and sometimes the most profound wisdom came from the most humble places. In her own room, Victoria lay awake thinking about the evening's revelation. She'd built her career on credentials and achievements, surrounding herself with people whose worth was measured in degrees and accolades. But the most important lesson her son would learn was coming from a man whose only qualification was his capacity to care. It was a humbling realization and a transformative one. As sleep finally claimed her, Victoria found herself looking forward to tomorrow, not just because of Daniel's progress, but because she was learning something too, that the most valuable education often came from the most unexpected teachers. The transformation in Daniel was nothing short of miraculous. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria watched her son evolve from a child who dreaded math homework to one who eagerly awaited his evening sessions with James. The change wasn't just academic, it was fundamental, touching every aspect of Daniel's confidence and self-perception. Mom, guess what happened today? Daniel burst through the front door on a Wednesday afternoon, his backpack sliding off his shoulder as he rushed to find her. Victoria was in her home office wrapping up a conference call with investors in Tokyo, but the excitement in her son's voice made her quickly end the conversation. What happened, sweetheart? She asked, pulling off her headset. Mrs. Peterson asked me to help Jennifer with fractions during partner work. Daniel's eyes sparkled with pride. Me. She asked me to teach someone else. Victoria felt her breath catch. 3 weeks ago, Daniel had been the one needing help, the one other children whispered about during math time. Now he was being asked to tutor his classmates. How did it feel? She asked, studying his animated face. Amazing, I used the cookie trick that Mr. Carter taught me and Jennifer totally got it. She said I explained it better than the textbook. Daniel paused, his expression growing thoughtful. Is this how Mr. Carter feels when he helps me, like really happy inside? I think so. There's something special about helping someone else understand something difficult. Daniel nodded vigorously. I want to be a teacher when I grow up, like Mr. Carter. The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. Her son, who just weeks ago believed he was stupid, now wanted to dedicate his life to helping others learn. James had done more than fix Daniel's relationship with math. He'd shown him a possible future. That evening, as had become routine, James arrived at 7:30 sharp. Victoria had offered to increase his cleaning company's contract to accommodate the extra time he spent with Daniel, but James had politely declined, insisting that his evening work remained separate from the tutoring. "Good evening, Professor Daniel," James said with a grin as he entered the living room. It had become his nickname for Daniel after the boy had successfully explained long division to Marcus the previous week. "Mr. Carter, I helped someone at school today." Daniel launched into the story of his tutoring session with Jennifer, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. James listened intently, his face lighting up with genuine pride. "That's incredible, Daniel. Do you know what that means?" "That I'm getting better at math. It means you're not just learning, you're understanding so deeply that you can teach it to others. That's the highest level of knowledge there is." Victoria watched from the kitchen doorway as James opened his worn leather bag. Over the weeks, she'd come to recognize the contents: colored blocks, measuring cups, coins from different countries, even small toys that Daniel had contributed to the teaching arsenal. Each object had a purpose, a way of making abstract concepts concrete and accessible. "Tonight I thought we'd tackle something new," James said, pulling out a deck of playing cards. "Your mom mentioned you're curious about percentages." Daniel's face clouded slightly. "We started those in class yesterday. They seem really hard." "They're not hard," James said confidently. "They're just fractions wearing a disguise, and you're already a fraction expert." He shuffled the cards and dealt out 10. "If I deal you 10 cards and 5 of them are red, what fraction of your cards are red?" Daniel counted carefully. 5 out of 10. So 5/10. Perfect. And 5/10 can be simplified to what? 1/2. Exactly. Now 1/2 can also be written as 50%. They're all the same thing: 5 out of 10, 1/2, 50%. Just different ways of saying the exact same relationship. Victoria watched Daniel's face as the connection clicked into place. It was a look she'd come to treasure, the moment when confusion transformed into clarity, when the impossible became inevitable. "So 25% is the same as 1/4, Daniel asked. "You got it. And if you have 20 cookies and you eat 25% of them, how many did you eat?" Daniel thought for a moment, visualizing the cookies. 1/4 of 20, that's 5 cookies. Brilliant. See, you already knew percentages. You just didn't know that's what they were called. As the session continued, Victoria found herself drawn into the lesson, despite having mastered these concepts decades ago. There was something mesmerizing about James's teaching method, the way he built bridges between the known and unknown, making each new concept feel like a natural extension of what Daniel already understood. "You know what I love about the way you learn," James told Daniel as they finished up. "You don't just memorize, you connect. You ask why and how instead of just what. That's going to serve you well in everything you do." "Will you tell me about when you were in school?" Daniel asked suddenly. "Did you like math when you were my age?" James was quiet for a moment, his expression growing distant. "Actually, I hated it. I was a lot like you, smart, but nobody seemed able to explain things in a way that made sense to me." "Really? But you're so good at teaching it." "Maybe that's why I'm good at teaching it. I remember what it feels like to sit in a classroom listening to explanations that might as well be in a foreign language." Victoria stepped into the room, curious despite herself. "What changed for you?" James looked up, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My grandfather. He never went to school past the 8th grade, but he was the wisest man I ever knew. When I was about Daniel's age, struggling with fractions just like he was, my grandfather sat me down at his kitchen table." "What did he do?" Daniel asked, completely absorbed. "He had been making bread that day, and he showed me how he divided the dough. 'James,' He said, "This whole batch of dough will make 4 loaves. If I give 1 loaf to Mrs. Henderson next door, what part of my bread am I giving away?" I said 1 loaf out of 4. He said, "That's right, 1/4. And if I give away 3 loaves, I'm giving away 3/4. Just like that, fractions made sense. "Just like the cookies," Daniel exclaimed. "Exactly like the cookies. My grandfather taught me that math isn't about memorizing rules. It's about understanding relationships. Everything in math is connected to everything else, and once you see those connections, it all becomes much easier." Victoria felt a lump forming in her throat. "Your grandfather sounds like a wonderful teacher." He was. He only had an 8th grade education, but he understood something that a lot of educated people miss. Learning has to connect to real life, or it's just meaningless symbols on a page. "Is that why you wanted to help me?" Daniel asked. "Because you remembered how it felt to be confused?" James nodded. "Partly, but also because I could see how smart you are. You think differently than some people, but that's not a weakness, it's a strength. The world needs people who see things from different angles." After James left that evening, Daniel seemed unusually thoughtful. As Victoria tucked him into bed, he asked, "Mom, do you think Mr. Carter ever feels bad that he didn't go to college?" The question caught Victoria off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because he's smarter than all those tutors with fancy degrees. But people might not know that, because he cleans buildings instead of teaching in a school." Victoria sat on the edge of Daniel's bed, struck by her son's insight. "You're right. Sometimes the world makes mistakes about who's valuable and who isn't. That's not fair." "No, it's not. But you know what, you're learning to see people for who they really are, not just what their job title says. That's a very important skill." Daniel yawned, already half asleep. "When I'm a teacher, I'm going to make sure every kid feels smart." "I know you will, sweetheart." As Victoria turned off the lights, she reflected on Daniel's observation. Her son was learning more than math from James. He was learning about human worth, about the difference between credentials and wisdom, about looking beyond surface appearances to find the truth underneath. The next few days brought a new challenge. Daniel came home from school on Friday with a newsletter announcing the annual school math fair, a competition where students would demonstrate their mathematical understanding to judges, parents, and classmates. "I want to enter," Daniel announced, holding up the flyer. Victoria's heart raced. "Are you sure it's voluntary? You don't have to." "I want to," Daniel said firmly. "I want to show everyone that I'm good at math now." "What would you present?" Victoria asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the anxiety building in her chest. "I want to show how fractions and percentages are connected, like how Mr. Carter taught me. I think other kids might be confused about it too." Victoria felt a mixture of pride and terror. The math fair was a public event. If Daniel struggled or became overwhelmed, it would be in front of his entire school community. But the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. "Let's talk to Mr. Carter about it," she suggested. "See what he thinks." That evening, when James arrived for their usual session, Daniel immediately launched into his math fair proposal. James listened thoughtfully, asking questions about the format and audience. "I think it's a fantastic idea," James said finally. "But I want to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Are you entering because you want to share what you've learned, or because you want to prove something to people who doubted you?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Both, I think. Is that okay?" James smiled. "It's perfectly okay. Just remember that your worth isn't determined by how well you perform at the fair. You're already successful because you understand the concepts and you can help others learn them. Will you help me prepare?" "Of course. But Daniel, this has to be your presentation. I can help you practice and give you advice, but the ideas and the explanation have to come from you." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel threw himself into preparation with an intensity that amazed Victoria. He created visual aids using the same hands-on materials James had introduced: bottle caps for fractions, play money for decimals and percentages, even a poster showing how cooking measurements connected to mathematical concepts. "Look, Mom," Daniel said one evening, practicing his presentation in the living room. "If you have $1, that's 100 cents, right? So 25 cents is 25 out of 100, which is 25%. But 25 cents is also the same as a quarter, which is 1/4 of $1. So 25% and 1/4 are exactly the same thing." Victoria watched her son explain the concept with clarity and enthusiasm, remembering the sobbing child who had sat in this same room just 2 months ago, convinced he was stupid. The transformation was so complete it almost seemed like a different child. James attended every practice session, offering gentle suggestions and encouragement. Victoria noticed how he never took credit for Daniel's understanding, always framing the success in terms of Daniel's hard work and natural ability. "You know what impresses me most about your presentation," James told Daniel during one rehearsal. "You're not just showing that you understand math, you're showing other kids that they can understand it too. That's what real teachers do." "Do you think I'll do okay at the fair?" Daniel asked, a note of nervousness creeping into his voice. "I think you'll do exactly what you're supposed to do," James replied. "And that's enough." The night before the math fair, Daniel could barely sleep. Victoria found him in his room at 10 o'clock, still awake and reviewing his notes. "Hey there," she said softly, sitting on his bed. "Getting nervous?" "A little. What if I forget what to say? What if the judges ask questions I can't answer?" Victoria smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Do you know what Mr. Carter told me the other day? He said that you understand these concepts so well, you could explain them in your sleep." "Really? Really? And you know what? Even if you make mistakes tomorrow, you've already won. You've conquered your fear of math. You've learned to help other children. You've discovered that you're capable of things you never thought possible." Daniel nodded, some of the tension leaving his small shoulders. "Will Mr. Carter be there tomorrow?" "He'll be working, but he said he'll try to stop by if he can." "I hope he comes. I want him to see that I can really do this." Victoria's throat tightened with emotion. "Sweetheart, he already knows you can do this. He's known it from the very beginning." The morning of the math fair dawned bright and clear. Daniel woke up early, carefully reviewing his presentation materials one final time. Victoria had offered to help him set up his display, but Daniel insisted on doing it himself. "This is my project," he said with quiet determination. "I need to take responsibility for it." They arrived at the school an hour before the fair began. The gymnasium was buzzing with activity as students set up their displays and parents snapped photos. Victoria watched Daniel arrange his materials with methodical precision, his nervousness masked by focused concentration. "Looking good, Professor Daniel," came a familiar voice. Victoria turned to see James approaching, wearing his work uniform, but carrying a small wrapped package. "Mr. Carter," Daniel's face lit up with joy. "You came? I wouldn't miss it. I brought you something." James handed Daniel the package. "For good luck." Daniel unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small wooden sign that read, "Ask me about fractions." It was clearly handmade, sanded smooth, and painted in cheerful colors. "Did you make this, Mom?" Daniel asked, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "Last night in my garage. Every good teacher needs a good sign." Daniel hugged James tightly. "Thank you. This makes it perfect." As other families began to arrive, Victoria noticed the curious glances directed at James. She realized that many people were wondering why their cleaning man was at an academic event, talking to the CEO's son like they were old friends. "Mrs. Hayes," came a voice behind her. Victoria turned to see Dr. Margaret Phillips, the Harvard PhD, who had quit tutoring Daniel months earlier. "I didn't expect to see you here. Has Daniel overcome his mathematical difficulties?" Victoria bristled at the woman's condescending tone. "Daniel never had mathematical difficulties, Dr. Phillips. He just needed someone who could communicate with him effectively." "Oh, and who was that?" Before Victoria could answer, Daniel called out. "Dr. Phillips, want to see my presentation. Mr. Carter helped me understand fractions and percentages." Margaret looked confused. "Mr. Carter, my tutor," Daniel said proudly, gesturing toward James. "He's the best teacher ever." Margaret's eyes widened as she recognized James from his custodial uniform. "The janitor is tutoring your son." The disdain in her voice was unmistakable, and Victoria felt her temper flare. But before she could respond, Daniel spoke up. "Mr. Carter isn't just a janitor," Daniel said with quiet dignity. "He's a teacher, and he's helped me more than anyone else ever has." James placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "It's okay, Daniel. Some people measure worth differently than we do." Margaret looked flustered. "I didn't mean to offend. I just meant that without proper educational credentials, the only credential that matters is the ability to help a child learn," Victoria interrupted. "And by that measure, Mr. Carter is more qualified than anyone I've ever met." The exchange was interrupted by an announcement that the judging would begin. Victoria squeezed Daniel's hand and whispered, "Remember, just be yourself." Daniel nodded and took his place behind his display table. Victoria and James moved to the audience area where they could watch without interfering. The first judge approached Daniel's table, Mrs. Anderson, the school's math department head. Victoria held her breath as the older woman examined Daniel's materials. "Good morning, Daniel," Mrs. Anderson said kindly. "I understand you're going to explain the relationship between fractions and percentages." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I want to show how they're really the same thing, just written differently." Daniel launched into his presentation with growing confidence. He used his bottle caps to demonstrate fractions, then showed how those same fractions could be expressed as percentages using play money. His explanations were clear and enthusiastic, peppered with real-world examples that made the concepts accessible. "So if I have 4 quarters," Daniel said, holding up the coins, "that's 100 cents or 100% of a dollar. But if I spend 1 quarter, I've spent 25 cents, which is 25%. And 25 cents is also 1/4 of a dollar. So 25% and 1/4 are exactly the same." Mrs. Anderson smiled. "That's a very clear explanation, Daniel. Can you show me how to find 30% of 60? Victoria's heart raced. This was beyond what Daniel had practiced. But her son took a deep breath and thought carefully. 30% is the same as 30 out of 100, which simplifies to 3 out of 10, Daniel said slowly. So I need to find 3/10 of 60. He used his counting blocks to group 60 into 10 equal sets of 6. If each group has 6 blocks and I take 3 groups, that's 6 plus 6 plus 6, which equals 18. Excellent. Mrs. Anderson made notes on her clipboard. You clearly have a strong understanding of these concepts. As she moved on to the next display, Daniel beamed with pride. Victoria felt tears starting in her eyes, overwhelmed by her son's success. More judges followed, each asking different questions, each receiving clear, confident answers from Daniel. But what impressed Victoria most was how Daniel began attracting other students, children, who stopped to listen to his explanations, and ask questions of their own. "How did you learn to make math so easy?" asked a girl from Daniel's class. "My teacher showed me that math is everywhere," Daniel replied. "Like when you're cooking or building things or even playing games. Once you see that, it stops being scary." "Who's your teacher?" the girl asked. Daniel pointed proudly toward James. "Mr. Carter. He's the best teacher in the world." Victoria watched as several children turned to look at James taking in his work uniform with curious but respectful eyes. One boy asked, "Is he really a teacher?" "The best kind," Daniel said firmly. "He teaches with his heart." As the fair continued, Victoria noticed a shift in the atmosphere around Daniel's display. Word had spread about the boy who had gone from struggling with math to teaching others, and about the unconventional tutor who had made it possible. Parents began approaching James, asking about his teaching methods. "I'm not a professional educator," James explained to one mother. "I just try to remember what it feels like to be confused, and I look for ways to make abstract concepts concrete." "But how did you know how to help him when so many trained teachers couldn't?" the woman pressed. James glanced toward Daniel, who was enthusiastically explaining decimals to a group of younger students. "Because I listened to him. Really listened. I tried to understand how his mind worked instead of forcing him to think like everyone else." Dr. Phillips, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. "But surely you recognize the value of formal pedagogical training, understanding, learning theories, developmental psychology." "Of course those things have value," James replied calmly. "But they're tools, not rules. Sometimes the most important thing is simply caring enough to keep trying until you find what works." Victoria watched the exchange with growing admiration for James's grace under questioning. He never became defensive or dismissive, simply stated his beliefs with quiet confidence. The climax of the fair came when the principal, Mr. Williams, approached Daniel's table with the panel of final judges. This was the moment that would determine the winners, and Victoria found herself gripping James's arm unconsciously. "Daniel," Mr. Williams said warmly, "I've been hearing wonderful things about your presentation. Would you mind walking us through your display?" Daniel straightened his shoulders and began his explanation once more. But this time something magical happened. As he spoke, his nervousness completely disappeared, replaced by genuine passion for the subject. He wasn't just reciting information, he was sharing something he truly understood and cared about. "The coolest thing about fractions and percentages," Daniel said, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, "is that once you understand how they work, you see them everywhere. In cooking, in shopping, in sports statistics, even in art, when you're mixing colors. Math isn't separate from life. It's part of everything we do." One of the judges, a local businessman, asked, "What would you say to a student who's struggling with these concepts?" Daniel thought for a moment. "I'd tell them that struggling doesn't mean you're not smart. It just means you haven't found your way yet. And there's always a way. Sometimes you just need someone who speaks your language to show it to you." "And who showed you your way?" the judge asked. Daniel turned and pointed directly at James. "Mr. Carter did. He taught me that fractions aren't scary, they're just friends you don't know yet." The judges smiled and made their final notes. As they moved away, Daniel deflated slightly, the adrenaline of performance finally wearing off. "How do you feel?" Victoria asked, approaching his table. "Tired," Daniel admitted. "But good. Really good. Even if I don't win anything, I'm proud of what I did." James knelt beside Daniel's chair. "You should be proud. You not only mastered difficult concepts, but you shared that knowledge with others. That's what real mathematicians do." "Do you think my grandpa would be proud?" Daniel asked suddenly. Victoria's heart skipped. Daniel rarely mentioned his father, who had died in a car accident, when Daniel was 4. But sometimes in moments of achievement or uncertainty, he would ask about the grandfather he'd never known. "Your father would be incredibly proud," Victoria said softly. "He always believed you could do anything you set your mind to." "I wish he could have met Mr. Carter," Daniel said. "I think they would have been friends." James looked puzzled, and Victoria realized he didn't know about her late husband. "Daniel's father died when he was very young," she explained quietly. "He was a teacher too high school English. He would have loved seeing Daniel discover his love of learning." Understanding dawned in James's eyes. "I'm sure he's watching," he said gently. "And I'm sure he's very proud." The fair concluded with an awards ceremony. Victoria felt her stomach churning with nerves as the principal took the microphone to announce the winners. Daniel sat between her and James, swinging his legs and chatting with nearby students, seemingly unconcerned about the results. The judges were impressed by the creativity and understanding demonstrated by all our participants, Mr. Williams began. "This year's third-place winner in the elementary division is Sarah Chen for her presentation on geometric patterns in nature." Applause filled the gymnasium. Victoria squeezed Daniel's hand, but he seemed genuinely happy for Sarah. "Second place goes to Marcus Rodriguez for his demonstration of probability using sports statistics." More applause. Victoria noticed that Marcus was James's son, and she watched James's face light up with pride. "And this year's first-place winner," Mr. Williams continued, "demonstrated not only mathematical understanding, but also the ability to teach and inspire others. The winner is Daniel Hayes for his presentation on the relationship between fractions and percentages." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Daniel's mouth fell open in shock, and Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. But what moved her most was the expression on James's face, pure, unguarded joy and pride. "Go get your ribbon, Professor Daniel," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel walked to the front of the gymnasium in a daze, accepting his blue ribbon and small trophy from the principal. But instead of basking in the applause, he immediately turned and pointed toward James. "I couldn't have done this without my teacher, Mr. Carter," Daniel announced into the microphone. "He taught me that everyone can learn math. You just have to find the right way to explain it." The applause grew louder, and Victoria watched as James wiped tears from his eyes. Around them she heard whispered conversations. Did he say the janitor was his tutor? That man taught him all of this. He went from failing to first place. But the whispers weren't dismissive, they were amazed. People were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something remarkable, not just in Daniel's academic achievement, but in the unconventional partnership that had made it possible. As the ceremony ended and families began to leave, Victoria found herself surrounded by parents asking for James's contact information. "I'm sorry," James told them politely, "but I'm not available for additional tutoring. Daniel is my only student." "Why?" asked one persistent father. "Clearly you have a gift for teaching." James looked across the room at Daniel, who was showing his trophy to Marcus and chattering excitedly about the experience. "Because teaching isn't about having many students. It's about giving everything you have to the ones who need you most." Victoria felt her heart swell with gratitude and something deeper, a profound respect for this man who had changed not just her son's life, but her own understanding of what truly mattered. As they walked to the parking lot, Daniel clutching his ribbon and trophy, Victoria realized that the real victory wasn't the first-place finish. It was the confidence in her son's stride, the joy in his voice, the absolute certainty that he was capable of achieving anything he set his mind to. "Mr. Carter," Daniel said as they reached their cars, "thank you for everything. Not just the math, but for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." James knelt down to Daniel's level one more time. Daniel, you didn't need me to believe in you. You just needed to remember how to believe in yourself. That was always there, I just helped you find it. As they drove home, Daniel chattered excitedly about the day, but Victoria found herself thinking about James's words. The belief had always been there, buried under layers of frustration and self-doubt. James hadn't created Daniel's potential, he had simply cleared away the obstacles that prevented it from shining through. That night, as Victoria tucked a very tired but very happy Daniel into bed, he asked, "Mom, can Mr. Carter keep coming, even though I don't need help with math anymore? Do you want him to keep coming?" "Yes, I want to learn more things from him, and I want to help him teach Marcus sometimes." Victoria smiled. "I think that can be arranged." As Daniel drifted off to sleep, his blue ribbon pinned to his bulletin board and his trophy on his nightstand, Victoria reflected on the journey they had taken. 3 months ago, her son had been drowning in self-doubt. Tonight he was sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he was smart, capable, and valued. And it was all because a janitor with no formal credentials but infinite wisdom had taken the time to see the potential that everyone else had missed. The weeks following the math fair brought an unexpected flood of attention that neither Victoria nor James had anticipated. Word of Daniel's remarkable transformation had spread beyond the school walls, rippling through Boston's tight-knit community of parents and educators, like a stone dropped in still water. Victoria's assistant Patricia knocked on her office door on a Tuesday morning, holding a stack of messages that seemed to grow thicker each day. Mrs. Hayes' Channel 5 News called again about that interview request, and there are 7 more parents asking if Mr. Carter might consider tutoring their children. Victoria looked up from her laptop, where she'd been trying to focus on quarterly projections, though her mind kept drifting to the profound changes happening at home. "Tell the news station we're not interested in publicity. And as for the tutoring requests..." She paused, remembering James's gentle but firm refusal to take on additional students. The man had been clear about his boundaries, and Victoria respected that. But she also understood the desperation of the parents calling she'd been in their shoes not so long ago. "Tell them Mr. Carter isn't available, but refer them to the Learning Center downtown. Dr. Martinez there has been implementing some hands-on approaches that might help." Patricia nodded and started to leave, then turned back. "Mrs. Hayes, if you don't mind me asking, how is Daniel doing? The whole office has been talking about his success." Victoria smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that filled her chest whenever she thought about her son's progress. "He's thriving. Really thriving. It's like watching a flower bloom after a long winter." That evening, Victoria arrived home to find an unexpected scene in her living room. Daniel was sitting cross-legged on the floor with Marcus, both boys surrounded by homework papers, and James's familiar collection of teaching materials. But they weren't working on math, they were helping a third child, a girl Victoria didn't recognize. "Mom!" Daniel looked up as she entered. "This is Elena. She's in Marcus's class and she's having trouble with reading comprehension. Mr. Carter said we could try to help her the same way he helped me with math." Victoria looked at James, who was sitting quietly in an armchair, observing but not directing the children's interaction. "Is this okay?" she asked him quietly. "Elena's mother works 2 jobs, James explained in a low voice. She asked if I might help, but I told her I don't know much about reading instruction. Daniel suggested we try anyway, using the same principles that worked for math." Victoria watched in fascination as Daniel patiently walked Elena through a passage from her English homework. He was using the same kind of concrete connections that James had taught him, relating the story's themes to experiences the girl might have had. "See when the character feels nervous about the first day at a new school," Daniel was saying. "It's like how I felt nervous about the math fair. The author wants us to understand that feeling so we care about what happens to the character." Elena nodded slowly, her face brightening with understanding. So it's like the author is trying to make us friends with the character. Exactly, Marcus chimed in. Just like how Mr. Carter made Daniel friends with fractions. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her son, the boy who had struggled so much with his own learning, now helping another child find her way. The compassion and patience he was showing came naturally, as if James's teaching methods had become part of Daniel's own approach to understanding the world. "How long has this been going on?" Victoria asked James. "Just today. Elena's mother Carmen works as a housekeeper for the Johnsons on Marlborough Street. She mentioned her daughter's struggles and—" James shrugged. "I couldn't say no, but I want to be clear, this isn't me starting a tutoring business. This is just neighbors helping neighbors." The distinction was important to James, Victoria realized. He wasn't trying to capitalize on Daniel's success or transform his life into something it wasn't. He was simply responding to need with the same quiet generosity that had saved her son. Over the next hour, Victoria watched the three children work together with James, offering gentle guidance when needed. Elena's reading improved noticeably as Daniel and Marcus helped her connect the text to her own experiences. But more than that, Victoria could see all three children growing in confidence and empathy. "You know what's interesting?" she said to James as they cleaned up after the children had finished. "Daniel is using the exact same techniques you used with him, but he's applying them to a completely different subject." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's because the techniques aren't really about math. They're about learning how to learn. Once a child understands that knowledge connects to life, they can apply that understanding anywhere." "Is that what your grandfather taught you?" "In a way, he taught me that wisdom isn't about knowing facts. It's about understanding how things fit together. How people fit together." Victoria found herself studying James's face, seeing depths there she was only beginning to appreciate. "You could have been a teacher, you know. Professionally, I mean. You have a gift for it." James was quiet for a moment, gathering the bottle caps and blocks into his worn leather bag. "Life doesn't always give us the paths we might have chosen, but sometimes the path we get leads us exactly where we need to be." "Do you ever regret not going to college, not pursuing education formally?" The question hung in the air between them. Victoria immediately regretted asking. It worried she might have touched on something painful. But James's expression remained serene. "Mrs. Hayes, I've learned more from cleaning office buildings at night than some people learn in 4 years of college. I've seen how different people work, how they treat others, what drives them. I've raised a son who's kind and curious and confident. I've helped children discover they're capable of more than they knew. Regret seems like a luxury I can't afford." His words carried a quiet dignity that made Victoria ashamed of her assumption that his life needed defending. James Carter didn't need validation from anyone, least of all from her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That was presumptuous of me. No need to apologize. But I want you to understand something. What happened with Daniel, that wasn't magic. It was just two people who cared about a child working together to find what he needed. The miracle isn't in the method, it's in the caring." The next few weeks established a new routine. 3 evenings a week, Elena joined Daniel and Marcus for what the children had dubbed Homework Club. James continued to guide their sessions, but increasingly the children were helping each other, sharing strategies and insights with a generosity that amazed the adults. Victoria found herself lingering in the living room longer each evening, drawn by the warmth and energy of the group. She began to see aspects of Daniel she'd never noticed before. His natural leadership abilities, his intuitive understanding of how to break down complex ideas, his genuine pleasure in helping others succeed. "You know what I think?" Daniel said one evening as they worked on Elena's science homework. Learning is like building with Legos. You have to understand how each piece fits before you can build something big. That's a beautiful analogy, James told him. Where did that come from? Daniel shrugged. I don't know. It just makes sense to me. Like Elena was trying to understand photosynthesis, but she was thinking about it as one big, complicated thing. But if you break it down, plants need sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make food. Then it's just 3 simple pieces that fit together. Victoria watched Elena's face light up as Daniel's explanation clicked into place. It struck her that her son wasn't just learning academic subjects. He was developing wisdom about how learning itself worked. That night, after the children had gone home and Daniel was asleep, Victoria found herself in her study, unable to concentrate on work. The transformation in her home from a place of academic anxiety to one of joyful discovery had affected her more deeply than she'd realized. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her mother's number. "Hi, Mom," Victoria answered, settling back in her chair. "Victoria, dear, I keep hearing the most interesting stories about Daniel. Mrs. Patterson from the country club said her grandson was at some sort of math competition where Daniel won first place." Victoria suppressed a sigh. Her mother, Eleanor Hayes, was a woman who measured success in traditional terms: prestigious schools, impressive achievements, social standing. The story of Daniel's transformation would appeal to her competitive nature, but Victoria suspected she would miss the deeper significance entirely. "Daniel did very well at the school math fair," Victoria said carefully. "Well, of course he did. I always knew that boy was brilliant. I told you those learning difficulties were just temporary. Obviously, you found an excellent tutor. Which firm did you use? I want to recommend them to the Andersons. Their grandson is struggling with his prep school entrance exams." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tension that came with her mother's conversations. "Actually, Mom, Daniel's tutor isn't from a firm. He works for the cleaning company that services our building." Silence stretched across the phone line. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I'm sorry, dear. I thought you said the cleaning company." "I did. James Carter is a janitor, and he's the most gifted teacher Daniel has ever worked with." Another pause. "Victoria, surely you're joking. You're telling me you allowed some service worker to tutor your son instead of hiring a proper educator." The disdain in her mother's voice ignited something fierce in Victoria's chest. "I'm telling you that this service worker accomplished what 10 highly credentialed tutors couldn't. He helped Daniel believe in himself again. But what about his background, his education, his references? His references are Daniel's confidence, Mom. His education comes from life experience and natural wisdom. His background is one of kindness and patience and genuine care for children." Victoria could hear her mother's disapproval through the phone. "Really, Victoria, I understand you're grateful, but you must see how this looks. What will people think when they learn you chose a janitor over qualified professionals?" "I don't care what people think," Victoria said, surprised by the force of her own conviction. "For the first time in months, my son loves learning again. He believes he's smart. He's helping other children discover their own potential. If that looks wrong to people, then they're looking at the wrong things." "Victoria, you're being naive. This man may be well-intentioned, but surely you can see the social implications. The only implication I see is that we live in a world that judges people by their job titles instead of their character. And I refuse to teach my son to think that way." Victoria hung up feeling shaken, but also strangely liberated. For years, she'd struggled to balance her mother's expectations with her own values. Tonight, for the first time, she'd chosen her values without hesitation. The next evening brought an unexpected visitor. Victoria was reviewing contracts in her study when Patricia called from home. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a woman at your door. Carmen Ruiz. She says she's Elena's mother and needs to speak with you urgently." Victoria found Carmen standing on her doorstep, wringing her hands nervously. She was a small woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands dressed in a housekeeper's uniform. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry to bother you at home," Carmen began in accented English, "but I had to thank you. What you and Mr. Carter are doing for Elena, it's changing her life." "Please come in," Victoria said, leading Carmen to the living room. "How is Elena doing?" Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "For the first time since we moved here from El Salvador, Elena came home from school excited about learning. She told me she wants to be a teacher like Daniel when she grows up." "Daniel isn't a teacher," Victoria said gently. "He's just a boy who likes to help." "No," Carmen said firmly. "He is a teacher. Maybe not in a school, but in his heart. Just like Mr. Carter." Victoria offered Carmen coffee, and they sat together in the living room, where so much learning had taken place. "Mrs. Hayes," Carmen continued, "I need to tell you something. When I first heard that Elena was being tutored by a janitor, I was embarrassed. I thought, what kind of education can this man give my daughter? But Elena insisted, said Mr. Carter was helping her understand things her regular teacher couldn't explain." Victoria nodded, understanding completely. "It's natural to have doubts. But now I see what my doubts really were. I was believing what this country tells people like me, that we are worth less because of the work we do. I was teaching Elena to be ashamed of people like us." Carmen paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue Victoria offered. "Mr. Carter is showing Elena that intelligence comes in many forms, that kindness and patience are more important than degrees and titles. My daughter is learning to be proud of who she is, not ashamed of where she comes from." Victoria felt a lump forming in her throat. "Carmen, your daughter is lucky to have you as a mother. Your courage in coming to a new country, working so hard to give her opportunities, that's the greatest education you could provide." Mr. Carter told Elena the same thing. He said that every family has different kinds of wealth, and love and hard work are the most valuable kinds. As Carmen prepared to leave, she pressed something into Victoria's hand, a small, carefully wrapped package. "For Daniel," she explained. "Elena made it herself." After Carmen left, Victoria opened the package to find a hand-drawn card. On the front, Elena had drawn 3 figures labeled Daniel, Marcus, and Elena, sitting around a table covered with books. Inside, in careful cursive, she had written, "Thank you for teaching me that I am smart. Love, Elena." Victoria carried the card upstairs to Daniel's room, where she found him reading before bed. "Elena made this for you," she said, handing him the card. Daniel read it carefully, his face glowing with pride. "Mom, look what she wrote. She says I taught her she was smart. But I didn't teach her that, I just helped her see it. That's exactly what teaching is, sweetheart. Helping people see what was already there." Daniel looked up at her with serious eyes. "Is that what Mr. Carter did for me?" "Yes. And it's what you're doing for Elena. And what you do for the people at your company." Victoria paused, struck by the unexpected parallel. "I suppose, yes, in a way. When I help people develop their potential at work, I'm teaching them too." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe everyone's a teacher sometimes. Maybe teaching isn't just something teachers do in schools." The wisdom in her 8-year-old son's words took Victoria's breath away. "I think you might be right about that." The following week brought news that would test everyone's resolve. Victoria was in her office when Patricia burst in, her face pale with concern. Mrs. Hayes, you need to see this. Patricia thrust a newspaper at her, folded open to the local news section. The headline read, Beacon Hill CEO employs janitor as son's tutor. Below it was a photo of Victoria and Daniel at the math fair, with James visible in the background. Victoria's hands trembled as she read the article. While not explicitly critical, the piece carried an undertone of bewilderment, as if the writer couldn't quite understand why someone of Victoria's means would make such an unconventional choice. Worse, it included quotes from anonymous education experts, questioning the wisdom of employing unqualified tutors. How did they get this story? Victoria asked. I think someone at the math fair must have tipped them off. The article mentions several details that only people there would know. Victoria's phone began ringing immediately. The first call was from her company's public relations director, concerned about potential impact on Victoria's professional reputation. The second was from her mother, who was mortified beyond words. The third was from a colleague asking if Victoria had lost her mind. But it was the fourth call that worried Victoria most. James's voice was tense when she answered. Mrs. Hayes, I've seen the newspaper. I think maybe we should stop the tutoring sessions. What? No, James, you can't let some reporter's opinion change what we're doing. It's not about the reporter. It's about Daniel. This attention, this scrutiny, it's not fair to him. He shouldn't have to defend his choices or mine. Victoria felt panic rising in her chest. James, please don't make any hasty decisions. Let me come home. We'll talk about this properly, Mrs. Hayes. I appreciate everything you've done for Marcus and me. You've been more generous than we had any right to expect. But I won't be responsible for damaging your family's reputation. Our reputation is fine, better than fine. We're proud of what Daniel has accomplished. But James had already hung up. Victoria left work immediately, driving home through Boston traffic with her heart pounding. She found Daniel in the living room, sitting on the floor, with the newspaper spread in front of him. Mom, he said as she entered, why does this article make it sound like Mr. Carter helping me was weird? Victoria sat beside her son, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people don't understand things that are different from what they expect. But it's not weird. Mr. Carter is a great teacher. He helped me when nobody else could. I know that, sweetheart. And anyone who matters knows that too. Daniel looked up at her with worried eyes. Is Mr. Carter in trouble because of me? You haven't done anything wrong, Daniel. Mr. Carter hasn't done anything wrong. Sometimes the world just struggles to see value in unexpected places. Are people going to make fun of me at school? Victoria pulled Daniel into her arms, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on them. I don't know, honey. But if they do, we'll handle it together. What matters is that you know the truth about yourself and about Mr. Carter. That evening, James didn't come for their usual session. Victoria called him twice, but he didn't answer. Marcus wasn't with Elena at her regular study group either, leaving Daniel and Elena to work together with Victoria's uncertain assistance. Where's Mr. Carter? Elena asked. I have questions about my history homework. He's taking a break, Victoria said, not knowing how else to explain the situation to the children. Daniel looked at her sharply. Because of the newspaper. Victoria nodded reluctantly. That's stupid, Elena said with 8-year-old directness. Mr. Carter didn't do anything wrong. He helped us. Sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be, Victoria admitted. The next day at school was as difficult as Victoria had feared. Daniel came home quiet and subdued, carrying a sadness that broke Victoria's heart. How was your day? She asked gently. Some kids asked me about the newspaper. They wanted to know if it was true that our janitor taught me math. What did you tell them? I told them the truth, that Mr. Carter is the best teacher I ever had, and that he helped me believe in myself. Daniel paused. But they laughed. Victoria felt rage burning in her chest, not at the children who were only reflecting attitudes they'd learned from adults, but at a world that could make her generous, brilliant son feel ashamed of something beautiful. I'm proud of how you answered them, she said firmly. You told the truth with dignity. That's what integrity looks like. But Mom, what if Mr. Carter never comes back? What if I never get to thank him properly for everything he did? That night, Victoria made a decision. She couldn't control what newspapers wrote or what people thought, but she could control her own actions. And she would not let fear or social pressure rob her son of the most important relationship in his young academic life. She drove to James's apartment complex in Dorchester, a modest building she'd never visited before. The contrast with her Beacon Hill mansion was stark, but Victoria felt no discomfort, only determination. James answered the door, looking surprised and tired. Mrs. Hayes, how did you— Your address is on your employment file, Victoria said. May I come in? James hesitated, then stepped aside. His apartment was small but immaculately clean, with photographs of Marcus covering one wall and books stacked on every available surface. James, we need to talk. Mrs. Hayes, I've made my decision. It's better this way. Better for whom? Not for Daniel, not for Elena, not for Marcus, and certainly not for all the children who might benefit from your teaching in the future. James sat heavily in a worn armchair. You don't understand the position this puts me in. I'm a working man with a son to support. I can't afford to lose my job because some newspaper makes me look like I'm overstepping my bounds. Have you been told you're going to lose your job? Not yet, but then you're making decisions based on fear, not facts. Victoria sat across from him, leaning forward intently. James, 3 months ago, my son believed he was stupid. Tonight, he's worried that he'll never get to properly thank the man who showed him he was brilliant. You can't let other people's narrow-mindedness destroy something this important. It's not about what I want. It's about being realistic. Realistic? Victoria's voice rose with passion. What's realistic is that you have a gift that could change countless children's lives. What's realistic is that every day you let fear stop you from teaching another child somewhere is sitting at a kitchen table crying over homework, believing they're not smart enough. James was quiet for a long moment. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to come back. To keep teaching Daniel and Elena and Marcus. To show them that what we're doing matters more than what strangers think about it. And what about your reputation, your position in the community? Victoria smiled, feeling a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. My reputation will be just fine. It's built on something more solid than social conformity. And as for my position in the community, I'd rather be known as someone who valued substance over surface than someone who sacrificed her child's welfare for appearances. James studied her face, searching for doubt or hesitation. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Slowly, James nodded. All right. But Mrs. Hayes, if this gets worse, if it affects your business or Daniel's social standing, then we'll deal with it together, all of us. James reached for his worn leather bag, checking to make sure his teaching materials were still inside. I suppose Marcus and Elena have been wondering where I've been. Daniel, too. He's been worried that he did something wrong. That boy has never done anything wrong in his life, James said firmly. And he never will, as long as he stays true to who he is. Victoria felt tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. Thank you, James, for coming back, for believing this is worth fighting for. Mrs. Hayes, James said quietly, some fights choose us. This is one of them. As they walked to the door, Victoria realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer employer and employee, or even tutor and parent. They had become partners in something larger than either of them, a commitment to helping children discover their own worth, regardless of what the world might think about their methods. The drive back to Beacon Hill felt different somehow. Victoria saw her neighborhood with new eyes, recognizing both its privileges and its limitations. She had everything money could buy, but James had given her family something priceless, the knowledge that true education came from the heart, not from credentials. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new scrutiny, new opportunities for doubt. But tonight, Victoria Hayes felt more certain of her path than she ever had before. She was no longer just fighting for her son's education. She was fighting for a principle that could change how the world thought about teaching, learning, and human worth. And she was not fighting alone. The morning after Victoria's visit to James's apartment brought a crisp autumn day that seemed to shimmer with possibility. Daniel bounded down the stairs, his energy infectious as he discovered that Mr. Carter would be returning that evening. Really, he's coming back. Daniel's face lit up like Christmas morning. I was so worried that newspapers scared him away forever. Victoria smiled, pouring his orange juice. Mr. Carter doesn't scare easily. He just needed to make sure we were all committed to doing what's right, regardless of what other people think. And we are right, Mom committed. Absolutely. Victoria's voice carried a conviction that surprised even her. What we're doing matters more than what anyone else thinks about it. Daniel nodded solemnly, then brightened again. Wait until I tell Elena she's been asking everyone in class if they know any other teachers like Mr. Carter. The phone rang before Victoria could respond. Patricia's voice carried a note of excitement that was unusual for her typically composed assistant. Mrs. Hayes, you need to know about the calls we're receiving this morning. They're not what we expected. More criticism about the newspaper article. Quite the opposite. We've had 12 calls from parents asking about Mr. Carter's teaching methods. 3 from educators wanting to learn about his approach. And Mrs. Hayes, Channel 5 called again, but this time they want to do a positive piece about innovative teaching. Victoria felt a flutter of surprise. Positive? It seems the original article sparked a conversation that's bigger than just your family. Parents are sharing their own stories about children who struggled with traditional teaching methods. Some are calling it a movement. A movement. Victoria had never intended to start anything beyond helping her own son, but perhaps that was how all meaningful change began, with one person refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. What should I tell them? Patricia asked. Take names and numbers. I need to discuss this with Mr. Carter before we make any decisions about publicity. That afternoon, Victoria left work early again, but this time it felt different. Instead of rushing home in crisis, she was returning to something that had become a source of strength rather than anxiety. The house felt warmer somehow, filled with the anticipation of learning and growth. She found Daniel in the living room, carefully arranging his homework materials the way James had taught him. Each subject had its own designated space, each tool had its purpose. But more than organization, Daniel had developed something precious, a sense of ownership over his own education. I've been thinking, Daniel said, as Victoria settled beside him. Maybe the newspaper article was actually good. How so? Because now other kids might find out that there are different ways to learn. Kids who are sad like I was might find their own Mr. Carter. Victoria marveled at her son's wisdom. At 8 years old, he was already thinking beyond his own experience to how he might help others. This was James's influence, not just academic instruction, but a fundamental orientation toward generosity and hope. At exactly 7:30, the doorbell rang. Daniel raced to answer it, practically throwing himself into James's arms as soon as the door opened. "Mr. Carter, I missed you so much. I have a million things to tell you, and Elena has questions about her science project, and Marcus called to say he finished the extra credit math you gave him." James laughed, the tension from the previous days melting away as he absorbed Daniel's enthusiasm. "Slow down, Professor Daniel. We have all evening." As they settled in the living room, Victoria noticed something different about James's demeanor. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a quiet determination that made him seem taller somehow. "I've been thinking about what happened," James said, addressing both Victoria and Daniel, "about the newspaper and the attention, and I realized something important." "What's that?" Daniel asked, leaning forward attentively. "That when you believe in something, really believe in it, you don't hide from people who disagree. You stand up and show them why it matters." Victoria felt a chill of anticipation. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop treating this like a secret. Maybe it's time to show people what's possible when we throw out the rule book and focus on what actually works." Daniel's eyes widened. "You mean tell everyone about our way of learning?" "I mean show them. Let them see how 3 very different children can help each other discover they're brilliant." James opened his bag and pulled out a notebook Victoria had never seen before. "I've been writing down everything we've done together. Not just the methods, but the philosophy behind them. The idea that every child has their own language for learning, and our job is to become fluent in that language." Victoria's breath caught. "James, are you talking about writing a book?" "Maybe. Or maybe just sharing our story in a way that could help other families. I keep thinking about all the children out there who are sitting at kitchen tables right now believing they're not smart enough. What if we could reach some of them?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elena and her mother Carmen. They had walked from their apartment 6 blocks away, Elena skipping ahead with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Mr. Carter," Elena called out, rushing into the house. "I have something amazing to show you." She pulled a test paper from her bag, a reading comprehension quiz marked with a large A and a smiley face sticker. "I got my first A ever, and it's because I used the story connecting thing Daniel taught me." Carmen followed her daughter inside, her face glowing with pride. "Elena has been different since she started coming here. More confident. More curious about everything." "It's not just the grades," Elena added seriously. "It's that I understand now. Reading isn't scary anymore. It's like solving puzzles but with words instead of pieces." James knelt down to Elena's level, examining her test paper carefully. "Elena, this is incredible work. But I want you to remember something. This A isn't what makes you smart. You were always smart. This just proves you've learned to show it." "I know," Elena said with 8-year-old wisdom. "You taught me that. But it still feels really good to see it on paper." Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, brought by his aunt because his mother was working a double shift at the hospital. He burst through the door with his own news. "Dad, guess what happened today? Mrs. Johnson asked me to help tutor some 4th graders in math. She said I explain things in a way that makes sense to struggling students." James's face lit up with paternal pride. "That's wonderful, son. How did it feel? Like I was doing something important. Like maybe I could be a teacher someday, just like you." Victoria watched the reunion of their little learning community with tears in her eyes. These 3 children, who had each struggled in their own way, were now supporting each other and reaching out to help others. The ripple effects of James's patient teaching were expanding beyond anything she had imagined. "Actually," James said, looking around at the gathered group, "I have an idea. What if we don't just tell people about what we're doing? What if we show them?" "How?" Daniel asked. "What if we invited some of those parents who have been calling to bring their children here not for private tutoring, but for a demonstration? Let them see how learning can happen when we focus on understanding instead of memorizing." Victoria felt her pulse quicken. "James, are you sure that would mean opening our home to strangers, putting ourselves under scrutiny?" "Mrs. Hayes, we're already under scrutiny. But now we have a choice. We can hide from it, or we can use it to show people something better." Carmen, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I think it's a beautiful idea. When Elena started coming here, I was embarrassed to ask for help. But now I see that asking for help was the bravest thing I could do for my daughter." "And the smartest," Elena added firmly. Over the next hour, they planned what James called a learning demonstration. It would be informal, just a few families watching how the children naturally helped each other with homework, while James facilitated their discoveries. "The goal isn't to convince anyone of anything," James explained. "It's just to show them what's possible when we start with the assumption that every child is capable of brilliance." Victoria felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "When should we do this?" "Next week," Daniel said decisively, "before anyone can change their minds or get scared." James laughed. "Professor Daniel has spoken. Next week it is." The following Monday, Victoria found herself rearranging her living room to accommodate 8 families who had responded to their invitation. Patricia had fielded calls all week from parents, educators, and even a few reporters who had heard about the experimental learning group meeting at the Hayes mansion. "Are you nervous?" Daniel asked as they set up chairs and cleared space for the children to work on the floor. "Terrified," Victoria admitted, "but also excited. What about you?" "I'm not nervous anymore. I know what we do works. I know Mr. Carter is amazing. And I know that helping people is always the right thing to do." The simplicity and confidence of Daniel's answer steadied Victoria's nerves. He was right. They weren't trying to prove anything complicated. They were simply sharing something that had transformed their lives. The families began arriving at 7 o'clock. Victoria recognized some faces from school pickup lines and community events, but others were strangers who had heard about their group through word of mouth. The children ranged in age from 6 to 12, and their parents carried the familiar look of exhausted hope that Victoria remembered so well. James had insisted on maintaining their usual routine rather than putting on any kind of performance. The children settled on the living room floor with their homework, while James sat nearby with his collection of teaching materials. "Before we begin," James addressed the gathered parents, "I want to be clear about what you're going to see. This isn't a magic show or a special method. It's just children learning together with adults who believe in their capacity to understand anything." One of the fathers, a man named Robert, whose 7-year-old daughter struggled with reading, raised his hand. "But surely there must be some technique, some system." "The technique is listening," James replied simply. "The system is patience. Everything else is just tools." Victoria watched as James began working with the children, not as a teacher addressing students, but as a conversation partner, helping them explore ideas together. Daniel immediately took on a mentoring role with younger children, while Elena and Marcus supported classmates who were having difficulties. Within minutes, the magic that had transformed Victoria's home was evident to everyone in the room. A boy who had been labeled with severe ADHD became completely focused when James helped him connect his math problems to his passion for baseball statistics. A girl who had been failing reading comprehension blossomed when Elena showed her how to relate story characters to people she knew in real life. "How are you doing that?" whispered one mother, watching her son engage with homework for the first time without tears. "I'm not doing anything special," James replied quietly. "I'm just assuming he's intelligent and helping him prove it to himself." The breakthrough moment came when 6-year-old Lily, who had been diagnosed with a learning disability, successfully solved a word problem by acting it out with toys from Daniel's old collection. "I get it," she announced triumphantly. "If Tommy has 12 marbles and gives away 1/3, he gives away 4 marbles because 12 divided by 3 is 4. Her parents stared in amazement. "She's never understood fractions before," her father murmured. "Her teachers said she might not be capable of abstract mathematical thinking." "Every child is capable of abstract thinking," James said gently. "We just have to find the bridge between abstract and concrete that makes sense to them." As the evening progressed, Victoria noticed the atmosphere in the room shifting. The initial skepticism and nervous energy had transformed into something warmer, wonder, hope, and a growing recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Mr. Carter," asked Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a professor of education from Boston University, who had come to observe, "What's your background in pedagogical theory?" "I don't have one," James replied honestly. "My background is in caring about children and remembering what it feels like to struggle." "But surely you've studied learning disabilities, cognitive development, educational psychology." "I've studied children," James said simply. "Real children with real struggles and real brilliance waiting to be discovered." Dr. Mitchell looked puzzled. "But how do you know what methods to use? How do you assess learning styles and adapt your instruction accordingly?" Daniel looked up from where he was helping a younger boy with reading. "Dr. Mitchell, can I answer that?" The professor nodded clearly, curious about what an 8-year-old might contribute to this discussion. "Mr. Carter doesn't use methods," Daniel explained with the clarity that had become his trademark. "He uses understanding. He watches how my brain works, and then he talks to my brain in its own language. It's not about learning styles, it's about learning friendship." The room fell silent as the adults absorbed the wisdom of Daniel's explanation. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her son had just articulated something that most educational theorists couldn't express in 1,000 pages of academic jargon. "Learning friendship," Dr. Mitchell repeated slowly. That's actually a profound concept." "It's not a concept," Elena chimed in. "It's just what happens when someone really wants to help you understand something." As the formal demonstration wound down, the parents gathered around James with questions and requests. But Victoria noticed that their focus had shifted from wanting to hire him to wanting to understand how they could apply his approach with their own children. "The most important thing to remember," James told the group, "is that you already know your children better than any expert ever will. You know what makes them laugh, what scares them, what they're curious about. That knowledge is the foundation of all teaching." One mother raised her hand tentatively. "But what if we don't feel qualified? What if we make mistakes?" "Making mistakes is how we learn," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "Mr. Carter makes mistakes all the time. He just calls them discoveries and tries something different." James smiled at his son. "Exactly. The goal isn't perfection, it's connection. When you connect with a child's natural curiosity and build from there, amazing things happen." As the families prepared to leave, Victoria overheard conversations that filled her with hope. Parents were making plans to start their own learning groups. Teachers were discussing how to incorporate more hands-on, student-centered approaches in their classrooms. Children were exchanging contact information so they could continue helping each other with homework. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Mitchell approached as she gathered her things. I hope you realize what you've started here. This isn't just about tutoring. This is about reimagining how we think about education itself. We never intended to start anything, Victoria replied. We were just trying to help one little boy believe in himself. That's how all revolutions begin, Dr. Mitchell said with a smile. With one person refusing to accept that things have to stay the way they are. After everyone had left, Victoria found herself alone with James in the quiet living room. Daniel had gone upstairs exhausted, but glowing with pride at how well the evening had gone. Well, Victoria said, settling into her chair, I think that went rather well. James was organizing his teaching materials, but Victoria could see the emotional impact of the evening in his careful movements. Those children tonight, they reminded me why this matters so much. Because every child deserves to feel smart. Because every child is smart. They just need someone to believe it long enough for them to believe it themselves. Victoria watched James pack away his bottle caps and blocks, the simple tools that had worked such profound magic. James, what happens now? After tonight, I think we're going to have more attention than we ever imagined. I've been thinking about that. James paused in his packing. Mrs. Hayes, what if we could create something larger? Not a business, not a program, but a movement of people who believe that every child can learn. What would that look like? I don't know exactly. Maybe training sessions for parents and teachers. Maybe a network of learning groups like ours. Maybe a foundation that supports innovative approaches to education. James's eyes lit up with possibility. What if we could reach every child who's sitting somewhere tonight, crying over homework, and believing they're not smart enough? Victoria felt her heart racing with the enormity of what James was proposing. That would require resources, organization, a complete commitment. It would require exactly what we've already proven. We have the belief that every child matters, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to help them succeed. The next morning brought a flood of phone calls, emails, and media requests. The story of their learning demonstration had spread through social media overnight, shared by parents who had attended and educators who had heard about their approach. Patricia was nearly overwhelmed managing the response. Mrs. Hayes, Good Morning America wants to interview you and Mr. Carter. The Boston Globe wants to do a feature story, and we've received inquiries from families as far away as California asking about starting similar groups. Victoria felt dizzy with the scope of the attention. This is happening so fast. Sometimes change happens slowly, and sometimes it happens all at once, Daniel observed from his seat at the breakfast table. Mr. Carter says that when an idea's time has come, it spreads like seeds on the wind. His words proved prophetic. Over the next month, their story captured national attention in ways Victoria had never anticipated. But rather than being portrayed as an oddity or curiosity, their approach was increasingly framed as a potential solution to the crisis in American education. James handled the attention with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else. When reporters asked about his lack of formal credentials, he redirected the conversation to the children's achievements. When educators questioned his methods, he invited them to observe and learn alongside him. The beautiful thing about Daniel's success, James told a television interviewer, is that it's not unique. Every day there are children discovering they're capable of more than they knew. We just need more adults willing to meet them where they are and help them build from there. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Victoria's Foundation had received donations totaling over $50,000 from viewers who wanted to support their work. By the following week, they had been contacted by schools in 12 states, asking for guidance on implementing student-centered learning approaches. Mom, Daniel said one evening, as they watched James work with a new group of children who had joined their weekly sessions. Do you ever feel like we're living in a fairy tale? Victoria considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, Daniel had been a struggling, tearful boy who believed he was stupid. Now he was confidently tutoring other children while serving as an inspiration for educational reform across the country. If it's a fairy tale, she said finally, it's one we wrote ourselves, by refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. And by finding Mr. Carter. And by Mr. Carter finding us, Victoria corrected gently. The culmination of their unexpected journey came in December, when Victoria received a call that left her speechless. The MacArthur Foundation wanted to award James a fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant, for his innovative approach to education. They want to give him what? Daniel asked when Victoria shared the news. $500,000 over 5 years to continue developing his teaching methods and training other educators. Daniel's eyes widened. That's enough money to help thousands of kids. When Victoria called James with the news, his reaction was characteristically humble. Mrs. Hayes, I think there's been a mistake. I'm not a genius. I'm just someone who pays attention to children. James, that's exactly what makes you a genius. The award ceremony in Chicago was surreal for all of them. Victoria watched from the audience as James, dressed in a borrowed suit and looking overwhelmed but dignified, accepted recognition for work that had begun with a simple desire to help one struggling child. 6 months ago, James said in his acceptance speech, I was cleaning office buildings at night and tutoring my own son at our kitchen table. I never imagined that caring about children's learning could lead to this moment. But I've learned that when we start with love and add patience, extraordinary things become possible. He paused, looking out at the audience of distinguished scientists, artists, and thinkers. This award isn't really for me. It's for every child who has ever been told they're not smart enough, not fast enough, not good enough. It's for every parent who has fought for their child's right to learn in their own way. And it's for every educator who has chosen to see potential instead of problems. Daniel, sitting beside Victoria in the front row, beamed with pride. That's my teacher up there, he whispered to the woman next to him. After the ceremony, as they gathered for the reception, Victoria reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with her desperation as a mother, watching her son struggle. It had been sustained by James's wisdom and Daniel's resilience, and it had grown into something none of them could have imagined, a movement that was changing how the world thought about learning, teaching, and human potential. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Mitchell approached the same education professor who had observed their first demonstration. I want you to know that my university is completely restructuring our teacher education program based on the principles you and Mr. Carter have demonstrated. Which principles are those? Victoria asked. That relationship comes before curriculum. That understanding matters more than memorization. That every child is capable of brilliance if we're willing to discover their unique way of accessing it. Victoria smiled, remembering the night she had first encountered James teaching Marcus fractions with bottle caps. Those aren't our principles, Dr. Mitchell. They're just common sense that somewhere along the way we forgot to apply. As the evening wound down, Victoria found herself standing with James and Daniel on the hotel balcony, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The December air was cold, but the warmth of their shared accomplishment kept them comfortable. Mr. Carter, Daniel said thoughtfully, when you first started helping me with math, did you know it would lead to all this? James considered the question carefully. No, Daniel. I just knew that you deserved to feel smart. Everything else. Everything else was just what happened when we refused to give up on that idea. So what happens now? Victoria asked. With the foundation, the fellowship, all the attention, now we do what we've always done, James replied simply. We help children discover they're brilliant. We just do it on a bigger scale. Daniel nodded sagely. And we remember that it's not about being famous or winning awards. It's about making sure no kid ever has to feel stupid about learning. Victoria put her arms around both of them, these two people who had taught her more about education, wisdom, and human worth than all her years of achievement and success combined. A year later, Victoria stood in the auditorium of the Daniel Hayes Learning Center, named not after her family's wealth, but after the boy whose transformation had sparked a revolution in how America thought about education. The center, funded by the foundation that had grown from their living room demonstrations, served as a training ground for educators from around the world who wanted to learn James's approach. But more than that, it served as proof that every child, regardless of background or previous struggles, could discover their own brilliance when met with patience, creativity, and unwavering belief in their potential. On stage, James was leading a session for visiting teachers, demonstrating how fraction concepts could be taught using cooking ingredients. In the audience, Victoria watched educators from 6 different countries taking notes with the intensity of students discovering something revolutionary. And remember, James was saying, the goal isn't to get the right answer quickly. The goal is to understand so deeply that the right answer becomes inevitable. Beside Victoria, Daniel, now 9 and serving as a peer mentor for younger students, watched his first teacher with undimmed admiration. He's still the best teacher in the world, Daniel whispered. Yes, Victoria agreed, he is. As the session ended and the teachers dispersed to practice what they'd learned, Victoria reflected on how profoundly her understanding of success had changed. A year ago, she had measured achievement in stock prices and profit margins. Now she measured it in the light that came into children's eyes when they discovered they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. James approached as she was lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Hayes." Victoria smiled at the man who had taught her family the difference between earning respect and deserving it. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, you were cleaning my office building. Now you're teaching teachers from around the world. And you were a CEO who thought success meant winning at any cost. Now you run a foundation dedicated to helping children believe in themselves. And Daniel was a little boy who thought he was stupid. Now he's helping other children discover they're smart." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Daniel work with a group of younger students using the same patient techniques James had taught him. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. "James," Victoria said quietly, "do you ever miss the simplicity of when it was just the 3 of us in my living room?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about all the children who are discovering their potential because of what started in that living room, and I know we made the right choice. Even when it got complicated, even when we had to deal with criticism and skepticism and pressure, especially then, that's when it mattered most to keep going." Victoria nodded, understanding completely. The most important changes were never easy, but they were always worthwhile. As the afternoon light slanted through the auditorium windows, illuminating the faces of children and teachers working together in perfect harmony, Victoria felt a peace deeper than any she had known in her years of business success. This was what triumph looked like, not a scoreboard or a stock price, but a room full of people discovering they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. "Ready to go home?" James asked as the session wound down. "Yes," Victoria said, watching Daniel help a struggling reader sound out a difficult word with the same patience James had shown him. "Let's go home." And as they walked out together, the CEO, the janitor, and the boy who had brought them together, Victoria realized that home was no longer just a place. It was this feeling of belonging to something larger than themselves, this commitment to helping every child discover their own brilliance, this certainty that the most important lessons in life couldn't be bought or sold, only shared with love. The story that had begun with tears and frustration had become one of hope and transformation, proving that sometimes the most ordinary people, in the most unexpected circumstances, could change the world simply by refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. And in a small apartment in Dorchester, Carmen Ruiz was helping her daughter Elena with homework, using the same gentle techniques she had learned from watching James work with the children. Elena was explaining fractions to her little brother using bottle caps, her voice patient and encouraging. "See, Carlos, fractions aren't scary. They're just friends you don't know yet." The circle continued to expand one child at a time, one family at a time, one moment of understanding at a time. And somewhere in the city, other children were discovering that they were brilliant, that they were capable, that they mattered. All because a mother's love, a janitor's wisdom, and a child's courage had combined to prove that the most powerful education happens not in classrooms with the fanciest equipment, but wherever people gather with the simple belief that every child deserves to feel smart.